Hello, good afternoon. Hi, I'm Dean Eccles. I'm faculty here at MIT Sloan. And in the initiative on the digital economy at MIT, I lead social networks and digital experimentation research. So I'm a social scientist and statistician, both to give you a sense of my background. And as a disclosure, I previously worked at Facebook and I'm currently a consultant to Twitter, though obviously I'm joining here in my role at MIT. So I've done a lot of thinking about social media algorithms and how we learn what they're doing. Today, we're going to talk about how maybe the public, researchers, journalists, regulators could learn more about what they're doing by thinking about algorithmic transparency. And we have two leading experts to help us have this conversation. So first, we have Daphne Keller, who's the director of the program on platform regulation at the Stanford Cyber Policy Center. She was previously counsel at Google, where she spent a lot of time, I think she said maybe thousands of hours working on policy issues in search algorithms. But more recently, she's a leading voice on tech policy, including on privacy, speech, and intermediary liability. For you non-lawyers, that's like Section 230 and beyond. Kartik Hasanagar is professor of technology, digital business, and marketing at Wharton. At Wharton, he also directs their AI for Business Center. Among other things, Kartik is an expert on targeting and recommendation systems. He was quite early to the question of how algorithms, whether in social media or product recommendations, change people's patterns of consumption. So I think we've got the perfect set of panelists to have this conversation about algorithmic transparency, the value that this might present to the public, to regulators, to researchers, but also some of the challenges there. So I want to start with you, Kartik, because you did so much early research on recommendation systems and the idea of filter bubbles before everyone else was talking about this. And you've really carefully followed basically all the work in this area since then. So maybe you can catch us up on some of your early work there and what we know now about how recommendation systems, ranking algorithms shape people's consumption.
Yeah, sure, Dean. First of all, thanks so much for having me. It's a great pleasure to join this event and this panel in particular. Yeah, I think in terms of backing up and talking about some of the early work on algorithms and personalization in general, I'll say that maybe, in the mid 2000s, we did some work looking at, do personalization algorithms have an impact on consumer choice? And not surprisingly, they do have a very significant impact on choice. And whether you look at media consumption on YouTube or on news consumption on Google News or other places, personalized product recommendations on Amazon, Netflix recommendations, all these settings, very significant impact on choice. The extent of the impact, of course, varies based on the setting. In retail settings, a third of the choice is driven by recommendations. In media settings, the vast majority of choices being driven by recommendations and algorithms. We then did some work looking at how they impact those choices in particular, meaning, for example, this question of filter bubbles. And in 2010 and later in 2014, we had a couple studies that were initially looking at media consumption patterns that were affected by recommendations. So our first study looked at a few thousand iTunes users, and we measured the overlap in media consumed by users. In other words, the extent to which two randomly selected users consume media in common. Now, if users were fragmenting due to personalized recommendations, the idea would be that the overlap in consumption of content would decrease across users. And we found in that study that after recommendations were turned on, the overlap in consumption actually increased for all types of users. And this occurred mostly because the personalization algorithms were exposing us to more relevant content. And as a result, our consumption increased overall. And if our consumption increased overall, the likelihood of consumption in common increase. And this was the primary factor. A secondary factor that we found did also contribute was that the algorithms did help people branch into other interest areas. Now, of course, this was not a political news setting. And since then, there have been a few other studies that have looked at the impact of recommendations in political news settings. One which got a lot of attention was a 2015 study by researchers at Facebook, and they looked at whether social media algorithms expose us to diverse perspectives or not. So they looked at I think it was like 10 million plus people who have self-reported political ideologies, conservative, liberal, moderate, and they asked the extent to which they consume a cross-cutting perspective. And what their study found was that people indeed were not seeing the wealth of information or wealth of perspectives out there, and it was a narrow set, but mostly that study said that it was primarily due to choices users make, meaning who you connect with, who are your friends, are your friends diverse enough? The second factor was, what does the algorithm show to you? And the third is, among all the things the algorithm show, what do you click on? The first and the third being driven by user choices, and the second being driven by the algorithm. And they found that user choices, meaning who you connect with and what you click on, was the bigger factor driving the filter bubble than what the algorithm showed. And I think besides that, there was one other study I'll call out, which was by a group at Oxford and Stanford, and they looked at web browsing patterns of about 50,000 plus users, specifically those who consume news online. And they again found that people consuming news online were more likely to get exposed to material from the other side of the political spectrum. This is consistent with our study, and mostly driven by the increase in news consumption. If you're consuming 10 news articles previously and now you consume 100, the odds that you'll now consume something else goes up. But they did interestingly find that the increase in the ideological distance between users went up, even though you're seeing the other perspectives. You see more of your own perspective and you dig deeper into that. So they found that. So these are a few studies. And I think one last thing I'll mention is, recently a student and I did a bunch of simulations just looking at create different kinds of user preferences, different kinds of personalization algorithms, and different kinds of how people respond to choices. So data that feeds into the algorithm design itself, and people's response to algorithmic recommendations. And in the simulations, we found you can pretty much have any situation arise. You can have a situation where you see filter bubbles increase, ones where it decrease, and it really depends on what's the underlying preference of users and how the algorithm interacts with that. None of these individually have an unequivocal impact on the impact. It's the interactions between the algorithm design, the underlying preference, and so on. So I'll stop here, but those are a few studies.
Thank you. I think that's really helpful. I mean, one of the things to me this highlights is sometimes there's just this assumption that we know that filter bubbles are ubiquitous and that's a really good description of what's going on. But often things are a little bit more complicated than that. That sometimes that's present. Sometimes there's increased engagement is driving, exploring more sorts of content. And then as you highlight that actually there's all these different processes and they're kind of in a feedback loop with each other, right? Because the algorithms are responding to user choices and then users are making choices based on what the algorithm is. For example, who you might choose to follow on social media is driven by the algorithm. So if suddenly I have an unranked news feed, I might start unfollowing people because I'm seeing too much of their content. So have you thought about this kind of dynamic character of often the networks and the choices themselves in response to the algorithms? Maybe that's part of what you were getting at with those simulations.
Yeah, exactly. I think in the simulations, we were doing exactly these kinds of things, that first there's an underlying preference of people, and then they see recommendations and then they act on those recommendations. And indeed, it's a very complex interaction. And, it isn't that one particular choice of algorithm always increases or always decreases filter bubbles. It depends on how this choice interacts with how users respond. And I'll mention, even that Facebook study that showed that people's choices have an impact. Some of it comes down to, yes, what do you do when you see a cross-cutting perspective? And if you disagree, Are you going to unfollow that person? And then your network, meaning who you're connected with, is less diverse than before. And so maybe it was actually, it didn't help that the algorithm showed you a perspective that was so far out from yours. Maybe it would have helped. It was showing slightly different, but not the complete opposite. And so it's all these very complex interactions. And I think if we look at each individual study, I mentioned a few empirical studies in all different settings, and they tend to show similar things at some level, but they also tend to show a few different things. And I think it just comes down to, well, the way we interact and consume, say, news on Facebook is different than the way we might do it on Twitter, which might be different than the way we might do it on New York Times website, where you get algorithmic recommendations. It might be different than on Google. It might be different than on iTunes. I mentioned media consumption, and even going outside political news to other kinds of media consumption. And so it's, I think, it's one of those where it would be nice if there was a nice one line, algorithms have this impact, but it's very, very nuanced. But I think the narrative that algorithms cause the filter bubble is too simple. Is I think the main learning I have from there. It's far more nuanced than that.
Right, and I think one of the things that comes up here is just how important it is to actually study what these algorithms' effects are. And one kind of phrase or concept that has been associated with effects of algorithms is a notion of amplification. So the idea is that if social media algorithms are upranking some content, they're giving it more reach, they're amplifying it. And so I'd say even some policymakers have proposed creating new liability for platforms for any content that they amplify, right? And so this would perhaps be based on, we might hope, on some kind of nuanced perspective like what you've described, Kartik, but that might be very difficult to do. So Daphne, you've scrutinized this concept of algorithmic amplification and its suitability for policy uses. Should we somehow make liability or other things depend on whether content is amplified? Can we easily define and measure amplification?
Not really. My paper on this focuses a lot on legal questions about, whether there are First Amendment barriers to regulating that way, which there are, and it gets very complicated and interesting if you're a legal nerd. But this starting almost like epistemological question of like, what is amplification? What is the baseline we compare to identify when amplification is happening? Turns out to actually be really hard. So in search results, like the web search results that I worked on for a long time, it's, I think, relatively obvious to people how hard it is to identify a baseline, or like what would be the right search results so that you can then compare and say which ones are the wrong ones that are amplifying. But in news feeds, I think people have an intuition that there is a baseline, the news feed in Twitter or Facebook, for example, and the baseline they have in mind often is that like it should just be in reverse chronological order. So you follow people and you see what they posted most recently done. That's this sort of like state of nature that we can compare things to, which I think only makes sense for a really small set of social media users. If you follow a very small number of people, and you're on a platform that never introduces like strangers' comments in response to those people, or other kinds of like what Twitter calls strangers in your feed type introductions. If you're in this closed universe, then maybe you can do reverse chronological order and you see everything you want. But for everyone else, there are a whole bunch of problems that come up. Someone has pointed out that like if you follow a lot of people, then a chronological ordered feed is just giving you a random sample based on time, when you happen to look and have time to read 20 tweets or whatever. And that's not any more useful or authentic than other ranking systems. Similarly, putting things in just chronological order takes away the ability to respond to people who are trying to game the system. And there are always people trying to game the system. In the web search context, you might call this spam. I think Twitter also uses the terminology of spam for this. If you're in reverse chronological order and somebody starts tweeting the same ad every 10 seconds, that will take up your entire feed. And the things that correct for this, that platforms deploy, are algorithms. Similarly, outside the commercial context, if we think about coordinated inauthentic behavior, which is people, again, trying to game the system and trying to manipulate the algorithm in order to promote a particular political message or whatever, that too is something that platforms respond to through ranking algorithms. And so then you get into this impossible question about authenticity. If those people are being inauthentic, can platforms de-amplify to make things more authentic? Which of these things is the real depiction of what you should be seeing on the internet, and which is the amplified one? So I think, it's not that this means we can never talk about amplification or the conversation is over. There's a ton to say, and there are certainly, I think, some really clear examples of things that are platforms algorithmically changing what users see in a way that's against the user's interests, that we should rightly critique. Similarly, questions about bias in ranking, bias based on race or gender, bias based on political perspective, any of these things, they are totally worth talking about. It's just we can't talk about them in a way that assumes that there is a magic baseline to go back to.
Can I say?
I think I wouldn't want to sort of close off the conversation of what effects algorithms have. I think actually more it's in some ways an opening that rather than just saying, oh, we can simply compare any ranking of content in social media and say, this is what it's amplifying, this is what it's not amplifying, that rather we need a richer understanding of that, including that the data is not just coming from comparing a ranking to how that same set of content would have been reverse chronologically ranked, but comparisons that might come out of A/B tests, out of randomized controlled trials. And if we look at both some of the kinds of evidence that Kartik, you've drawn on, other researchers have drawn on, and that the platforms themselves have drawn on to evaluate these ranking algorithms, it's by running A/B tests where they are randomizing users to different versions of the algorithms to try to capture some of these feedback loops, at least in their assessment of what those algorithms' effects are. So to me, at least one of the things that suggests is challenges around just mandating some transparency simply by saying, okay, you have to reveal how content would have been ranked chronologically, and that will tell us what was amplified or not, which I think is what some policymakers have had in mind, Daphne.
Yeah, I mean, I think the people who focus on the chronological order idea are usually, they're motivated by a belief that, probably not a false belief, that there is harmful content being made more visible by algorithms. And so they want to push back on that. And the way to push back on that is by nudging back toward, a perceived better world of the chronological order baseline, which I think is an entirely understandable set of motivations. I think that's different from what researchers or people focused on transparency want. They want to understand what the algorithm is doing now and what alternatives might be. And if that's what you're trying to do, then that opens up a whole different set of questions about like, what's the best way to do that? And I agree with you, like some like APIs to make bulk queries possible so that people on the outside can do the same kind of A/B testing that people on the inside can do. That is an obvious thing that that researchers and transparency advocates should be asking for.
Kartik, did you want to chime in here?
Yeah, I think the idea of transparency is really interesting. And I like what Daphne just said about, platforms opening up their APIs and making certain data available. Because right now where we are is that a lot of us who are interested in this question of what is the actual impact of these kinds of, let's say, social newsfeed algorithms on issues of social interest, we cannot answer most of them because the data is mostly with the platforms. And the platforms have been publishing some great papers. I mentioned the Facebook study, which is, in my opinion, very well done. There was a Twitter study recently on amplification, and mostly they were trying to answer this question or criticism by both the left and the right, each side claiming that Twitter amplifies the perspectives from the other side. And they did a study and they found, well, there isn't a huge bias, and that really political news in general gets amplified on Twitter when you switch from reverse chronological to personalized news feeds. But coming back to that point, only Twitter can conduct the study. And while I don't question the results of the study, the problem I have with a lot of this is that, all these studies at the platforms go through internal approvals. And so we know the ones that come out and see the light of the day. We don't know the ones that are not approved internally to come out. So, from a meta-analysis perspective, we don't know what we don't know. We only know what comes out. And so that's a problem. And opening up those creating APIs, making the data accessible is important. And I think that's also an important distinction between who is the transparency for. I think sometimes policymakers also confuse the issue because there's a lot of talk of transparency for end users. And sometimes it's even so confusing where people talk about opening up source code and so on. And there have been actual proposals. So Commodities and Futures Trading Commission previously considered a bill or proposed something to make traders expose their software because of a crash in the stock market that had happened because of trading algorithms. There was a proposal in New York City to make algorithms that are being used by the city open source, that anyone can use the source code. And so there's all this confusion. Is it for end users? What does transparency mean? Is it like revealing the source code? Is it revealing the data? Is it revealing what is the end outcome? And I think what's really important, at least in my view, is that the transparency is mostly for the data scientists themselves within the organization to better understand what their systems are doing, and for outside researchers to understand that. And for end users, that kind of detailed transparency doesn't help. And in fact, we have studies where we have found that, transparency doesn't buy trust or any of that from end users. But I think, one issue, just summarizing everything I said, I think, is platforms have too much of the control over the understanding of these phenomena, and exposing that to other researchers is extremely important. And I think from policymakers' perspective, it's really important to understand when we talk about transparency, who is it for? Do end users really care about very detailed transparency? And what does transparency for end users mean versus transparency for researchers or policymakers?
Yeah, and I think that's a great point, because some proposals, policy proposals that kind of go under the category of transparency are essentially proposals about user interfaces provided to end users, right? The Filter Bubble Transparency Act would require that firms provide some unranked feed available to users. It's, that might be an option that's valuable to users. Maybe that allows them to go around some ranking. Perhaps that's beneficial. It's unclear what the unranked version would be for some platforms where there's no clear chronological baseline. But that seems quite different than what, as you said, might be useful to researchers. And actually, in my testimony in the US Senate in December about algorithmic transparency, I highlighted just how hard it is to quantify some of the impacts of algorithmic ranking, right? I mean, if we think about what data scientists at these companies are doing, these people are experts and are spending a lot of time and effort and collecting new data, running new randomized experiments or A/B tests in order to answer some of these questions. And they're still having a hard time with it, right? If you read Twitter's latest paper about algorithmic amplification, they kind of admit that the paper doesn't answer a bunch of key questions about what the algorithms are doing because of these complex feedback loops. And so I think, to me, that suggests that, some minimal version of data release about just the content of the algorithm isn't actually enough to know what the algorithm is really doing, what effects it's really having, and that we might need something kind of more robust there, that we need, if we're going to get many benefits from this kind of algorithmic transparency, we'd actually need to be opening up things like these randomized controlled trials that these companies are running. And that to me seems like also a more difficult thing to bring about.
Yeah, so if I could jump in, like, I think there are a number of things that make it really, really difficult. In my field, people mostly are interested in researching how platforms moderate content, what they take down under their terms of service, what they do in response to legal mandates to take things down. And there's one overwhelmingly best resource for this, which is the Lumen database at Harvard. And this is an archive of actual takedown requests sent to platforms, mostly Google and Twitter. And because they were requests to Google and Twitter, usually they're referring to URLs that link to a website out there in the world that's still there, even if Google delisted it or Twitter took down the tweet. And so that means the researchers can come and see, like, who asked for this to be taken down and why, and what actually was this content. And so they can spot where errors were made. They can spot patterns of bias. Just this incredible wealth of research has come out of access to this raw data. But if you're talking about YouTube or Facebook or a hosting platform, then the piece where researchers can see the content itself goes away. And if we're talking about Facebook, where most things are shared privately, then you also have the problem that unless there's a big change to the GDPR, or which there might be, by the way, but to European laws around privacy and researcher access, and to a big discussion about privacy in the US, there's not a way for researchers to get a lot of the information that they want without making some major trade-offs with the privacy of the users. And so that's where we get into this situation where, yeah, the data scientists inside the platform have all of this, and lots of people outside platforms have really compelling arguments about the good they can do in the world if they had that access, but we have to navigate those really significant barriers and competing values.
I think that the privacy issue is a really interesting one, and just maybe to actually kind of push a little bit on the, sorry, I had some kind of a sound there. To push on this question of that everyone inside of the firm has all of this information. Actually, because of some of these privacy regulations, a lot of these companies aren't even retaining this data. Actually, if you want to answer historical questions about what users were seeing because of algorithms, because of A/B tests that were running in the past, in a lot of cases, that data has been deleted, in part to make compliance with privacy regulations easier. And so I think there are a set of interesting trade-offs there. And I guess one thing to think about is how we might make it possible for companies to responsibly share some of this data with researchers. What's possible there? I mean, kind of at the extreme, you have everything being either sort of like forbidden or required, right? Either there's some transparency that's required, they have to make this data available, or basically it's illegal to do so, right? Is there some way that we can create a middle ground that just would actually incentivize these firms to share some of this? And maybe they would like to do so. I mean, just public pressure was enough to convince Facebook to, through this partnership with Social Science One, share some data with researchers protected by some privacy technology known as differential privacy that's also now being used by the US Census Bureau, et cetera. But when they announced that project, they were threatened with lawsuits. So what can we do from a policy perspective to make room in this space for firms to do more responsible retention and sharing of data? Daphne, maybe do you have any more thoughts on that?
Sure. So, on the last panel, I know Renee was talking about PATA, the Platforms and Algorithms Transparency Act, I believe is what it stands for. So this is a draft bill that would create 3 significant new forms of transparency. One is a mechanism for academic researchers to get access to, truly inside data. The second is opening up, taking down legal barriers to scraping by researchers like the journalists who have used scraping content in order to find problems with political ads and so forth. And then the third is a huge increase in the mandated public transparency. So this is today's equivalent is transparency reports that are more or less platforms grading their own homework and saying, we took down this number of things under our hate speech policy and this number were appealed, and but you can't tell if they really got that right or not. So the public transparency measures in PATA and some other proposals are remarkably broad and would compel regularly updated disclosure of a whole lot of information. Meanwhile, in the EU, so PATA could pass, I would like to see movement on this in the US. In the EU, this is 100% happening. They're in the final stages of negotiating the Digital Services Act, the DSA. It has 4 or 5 different transparency provisions that are about public reporting. And then it has an article that's about researcher access to data, the final details of which are still being hammered out. And there are questions about how that will intersect with the GDPR that won't be answered for a while yet. But we are going to get greatly changed transparency in Europe. And I think that will affect access to information around the world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think those are very interesting developments. I guess to me, one of the things that it seems like is a step short of requiring that is just clarifying what's even legal in terms of data sharing, right? That the GDPR has created so much uncertainty about what is personal data or not. And so even some of these leading technologies for doing privacy protected data releases like differential privacy, there's been uncertainty about, does that satisfy some of the requirements of the GDPR if you are sharing data in that way? And so I think, at least from my perspective, that kind of clarity from regulators could be really helpful for transparency, even short of mandates, though obviously the mandates would bring some of that about. Kartik, I wonder if you have any thoughts on that, especially as a potential consumer, as a leading researcher in this area of this kind of data.
Yeah, so, I think the Platforms and Algorithmic Transparency Act that Daphne mentioned is really interesting in terms of the amount of access it will provide. But I think there's, it comes back to this issue of, there's still going to be many challenges, and I would love to see that happen. And I think it's a step in the right direction, but I don't think it's going to solve all of the issues. You brought up one issue, which is that, hey, there are other regulations being discussed in parallel, and nobody's thinking about how these interact with each other. And so, it comes back to this question of there's so much nuance, it's so complicated, and we don't necessarily connect the dots between one bill being looked at in one place and another bill being looked at in another place. The other perspective here is also that at the end of the day, the space is evolving so rapidly that, it's going to be a cat and mouse game where, the regulators are always going to be way behind. And, by the time they've understood a new platform and a new system, and then say, okay, here's what it means. The platform has evolved. It's a new social, what is social media? It used to be Facebook, then it's, Instagram, and then it's Telegram, and then it's something else. So it changes so rapidly. And so at some level, there's always going to be also this concern that regulations alone, just saying something's required, something's not, not required, is not going to solve this. And it might need, greater participation from those companies in terms of, not just going by the letter of the, whatever the law is saying, and doing more. And there again, there's challenge, because the moment they do something like that, that the possibility of lawsuits, media backlash is immense. I remember the Facebook study that was trying to show that algorithms can influence your choice, whether it's like whether you decide to vote in the election, or whether it is, the extent of how positive or negative your posts on social media are. And they face so much backlash from that, and then they backed off. And so now I think they conduct those studies, but they don't probably publish it, or it goes through a big approval process where most of those the studies don't actually see light of day. So I think it's so complicated, but while, I think it needs regulatory oversight, I don't think it's going to solve this, because, the regulators will always be so far behind. The other option is user education, but how are you going to educate this many people about what's going on and what you want? And that's, again, a challenge. So unfortunately, my answer is that it's a non-answer, in the sense I don't have a silver bullet. I don't have a solution to offer, but really acknowledging that this is going to be a hard one over the next several years and decades.
Thanks. And just to kind of pick up on that point of just this rapidly evolving space, like what would it maybe mean, some of these regulations, what would they mean in the context of something like TikTok or Share Chat, where I'm just opening up the app in the case of TikTok and seeing this video content, and now Share Chat has really pivoted into that same kind of a style, especially after India banned TikTok. And so that sort of a feed of content just looks very different. The kinds of affordances that you'd want to provide to users, the kinds of data that it would make sense to release about that look really different. So I think one of the challenges, how do we craft regulations that are going to cover all of that? So sort of not given out to these new entrants, but also not discourage potentially positive innovation in this space. Because if we care about things like continued dynamic competition here, it seems like the way social media platforms have been able to enter into this setting that has huge network effects is to try something kind of somewhat different, right? That you don't enter by copying Facebook. Maybe Facebook copies you later, but you enter by providing a distinct experience, and that comes with a whole bunch of different sorts of data and affordances.
Yeah, and I'll push that your example and anecdote of say TikTok, and push it even further. What if the next social media platform is on the blockchain? It's decentralized. People are trying to build it. And so it's a protocol, completely decentralized. It's all hard-coded in the protocol. There is no platform per se that you go to as a regulator and say, I want you to do this, I want you to do that. There's no one there who's going to sit and change that source code. The platform is out there. How do you regulate that? And so that's an example of what I mean, that it's evolving so fast. Now, I'm not saying that the next social platform will be on the blockchain, it will be decentralized, but it could be. And that just changes the entire discussion, and takes it to another dimension that makes all of the current conversation irrelevant. Because it's no longer this platform that's built an algorithm that you can force to disclose, that you can force, that you can regulate in certain ways. So that's one example, and we can come up with many more such examples about what the future social news consumption or media consumption platform will be. And, I think it'll forever remain a big cat and mouse game, but whoever's creating these systems, it's really important, for example, for technologists to understand social implications of technology. How many engineers coming out of an engineering school have any understanding of, anything, some of these ideas from social science? Some of the criticisms of Mark Zuckerberg actually come down to, does he fully understand the ramifications of these systems beyond the technological capabilities and the technological innovations and opportunities there? And again, I'm not saying those criticisms are right or wrong, but the point is that, building these systems, they have an inordinate impact. And I think it's important for the people who build and deploy these systems to be thinking in different ways. How does any engineer assess any algorithm today? It's like very clear technical metrics. What is the accuracy of your newsfeed recommendation algorithms? If you recommend 10 stories, what proportion of them are relevant, what proportion of them is the user not clicking on, things like that. None of this accounts for, does this fragment society? Does it increase diversity of consumption? How does this affect privacy? So, I think there's a multi-pronged solution here where legislation is one piece, but it requires so much more. It requires curriculum in engineering schools to change, in high schools to change, a bunch of these kinds of things.
Right. I guess that's one area that we can feel excited about as educators, that maybe we're potentially improving some of that. And I think actually on your point of how are these systems being evaluated at these companies, I think there's a variety of how, in terms of how sophisticated they are in looking at some of these consequences. We know that, for a long time, Google and other search companies have had human raters rating the quality of what they're seeing in feed and giving these kind of holistic but potentially quantifiable ratings and putting that into the loop of how these algorithms are being evaluated. And more recently, some of the social media companies do this. Facebook has tons of paid professional raters who rate their whole newsfeed based on is this making me feel connected to other people? Is this important information, et cetera? Trying to get at some of these more like considered responses that are not just what I'm clicking at. And so one beneficial thing can actually just be to see some of those more sophisticated practices diffuse in the industry. From some of the recent reporting, it seems like maybe TikTok hasn't had a lot of those signals about kind of negative responses that people might be having to content or any sort of attitudinal responses. So I do think that is a valuable area, is that just diffusing the cutting edge of what we're able to do to measure the effects of these algorithms is helpful.
I love that. Just a quick note, and I suspect Daphne will have a lot to add on that. Just a quick note. I really like that. And the analogy here is that, for example, if you look at say cloud computing, how to manage data centers. Facebook has open sourced a lot of its approach to managing data centers. Many other settings companies have, even if you look at machine learning, companies have open sourced their frameworks and so on, that many other companies have then used. And I think that's a great idea that, companies like Facebook, Twitter, Google that have been around a lot longer, that have been grappling with these issues for a while, that haven't solved it, but have clearly made a lot of progress that new entrants can learn from. Open sourcing best practices, what's worked, here's what we do. I would love to see such a document from these places, because much as we all criticize them, they are doing a lot too, and we want to see what are they doing, what have they not done. I think that would be just great. So I really like that suggestion. So just a +1 for that.
Yeah, and from some disclosures, say some of the leaks by Frances Haugen, who we heard from this morning, we know that there was a lot of really careful research grappling with this inside of these companies, even if sometimes executives didn't always act on that research. So there are a lot of best practices around measuring algorithms' impacts, even if sometimes the firms are making different trade-offs at the executive level. Yeah, Daphne?
So many things to respond to. So the Google, the search quality rater guidelines are public on the web. They're updated and have been public for as long as I can remember. And I never hear academics talk about them. And I think there's just this level of engineer to engineer discussion from a lot of companies where, engineers are writing things about how their machine learning models work for an audience of other engineers. And maybe it's, on a Medium blog post that the company comms team did or did not review very carefully. But because it's sort of this, I live in the world of social scientists and lawyers, and they don't read those kinds of things. There's this level of existing transparency that I think doesn't get attention in my part of the conversation. Not that it is in any way perfect, just that there's more information out there, and it is about, to Kartik's point, the sort of most sophisticated contemporary practices, because that's what the engineers are excited to write about, and the companies don't want to stop them too much because then they'll lose good employees. So there's a good, I think, interesting transparency space there. Dean, you were talking earlier about, when the next thing comes along and the old transparency model doesn't work for that next thing. I think that is a real risk with these legislative proposals, is that, they will lock in transparency models that are asking for the wrong thing. They will require companies to build the infrastructure, which is expensive if you're a small company, to report on notice and takedown, but really what matters is algorithmic ranking, or really what matters is the next thing that we haven't thought about yet. And so I think, regulators are slow, but legislators are even slower. So to the extent that there's an opportunity to have a sort of expert regulator be able to iterate on the requirements in response to changes, instead of it being something that only Congress can address, this very weighty process that rarely works. Yeah, I think we're better off with regulators setting these kinds of rules than with legislation. But what I'm seeing right now is there are so many facets to the transparency discussion. There's a set of asks from human rights prosecutors, for example, who want evidence of war crimes preserved when YouTube takes down videos of violence. There are asks from disinformation researchers. There are asks in the violent extremism space, and that they're not necessarily talking to each other. And if you put them all together, there's sort of this desire to know everything. It gets to this, there's a Jorge Luis Borges story about an emperor who makes a map that's so detailed, it's the size of the territory. Like, we're getting to this asking for a map the size of the territory situation, and we can't actually have that. We need to have researchers and algorithm experts and all the sort of players in this discussion get together and try to figure out a ranked list of priorities, because we're not going to get everything. Just a final thing, Kartik, you mentioned the blockchain-based model and sort of a system so distributed that there's no choke point to regulate it, which of course is the web we used to have, right? Like, we've been there before. But I tend to think it wouldn't stay that way in the blockchain version for the same reason it didn't stay that way on the web, which is people want gatekeepers to keep out the bullies and the spam and the racists and et cetera. And they want gatekeepers sometimes to amplify the content that they're interested in. And once you have somebody who's doing that, even if all the content is out there in such a distributed system that it can't be regulated, out on the blockchain where it sits, but once you have a centralized entity doing the gatekeeping to serve users' demands, that becomes the thing that can be regulated to serve government demands. So I tend to think that we will get back to a situation like the one we have today.
And I think actually an interesting follow-up question from the audience is just how should regulators respond to the idea that there could be this kind of decentralized social platform? Should regulators allow that to exist, or what are the appropriate ways of thinking about how you might provide some structure there? And I think part of what you're saying, Daphne, is that just naturally users are going to want a friendlier version of this. I mean, if you look at all the sort of distributed stuff happening on the blockchain overall, it's not very user friendly at the moment. And so users may need some web service that's more centralized to help them navigate that. And so in practice, the vast majority of people may be experiencing a more centralized version of the decentralized experience. But how should regulators approach the possibility of something like that emerging?
Well, I guess I hope they don't. It strikes a little bit of a chill into me to think that internet technologies should check in with regulators, and which countries regulators, and So, I think regulators should anticipate things like this developing, think about how they're going to respond. But the idea of maybe them being the gatekeepers that stop technologies from existing at all, hopefully isn't how they see their roles.
Yeah, I mean, I also think that's a kind of a worrying thought. And I mean, another perspective on it is perhaps some of the regulatory choices they make for existing platforms may be the kinds of things that push users and firms towards implementing something that may be a lot harder to responsibly regulate anyway.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. So I've thought about this in the context of what my Stanford colleague Francis Fukuyama calls middleware, or what I've called magic APIs, which is the idea that if we want there to be less of a chokehold on discourse, by today's giant platforms, one response is to introduce competition at the layer of the content moderation and ranking algorithms, so that as a user, you can say, well, I want to use Facebook, but I want Disney's ranking or ESPN's ranking, or like a Black Lives Matter affiliated group's content moderation rules. And you set those knobs and dials yourself. And so we get to different versions that we experience. And there's no one algorithm that is so consequential as the algorithms deployed by Facebook or Google or YouTube today. So that is a version of a distributed content moderation model. Of course, it is kind of a hub and spoke model, where sitting in the center, you still have Facebook hosting the content or YouTube hosting the content, and they're the nexus for like copyright takedown requests or child sexual abuse takedown requests, like the serious legal stuff that governments legitimately want somebody to handle. I love this idea because it gets around a bunch of legal problems, and it's about fostering user autonomy and diversity rather than like top-down state regulations of content. But it presents, its own version of the privacy problems we just talked about. It presents some serious questions about how revenue flows to these new middleware providers. It presents serious questions about the cost of content moderation if they're all replicating the same work of, translating a song from Russian to see if it's obscene or, whatever. So there's just a bunch of logistical stuff to do about that. But that's great. It's logistical stuff. It's not a fundamental First Amendment problem or a fundamental conceptual problem of the sort that we run into with a lot of other proposals.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting area that a lot of people, imagine being beneficial, is having that kind of algorithmic choice somehow in there. But yeah, presenting so many different problems. I think if there's one thing we learned from things like the Cambridge Analytica scandal, is that individual users may often choose to give access to their data to other developers that they don't know that much about. And in the process, not only are they really giving access to their data to those developers, but in the context of social media, they're giving access to all the content that's produced by their friends and the people they follow, et cetera. And so it seems like, one of the criticisms of Facebook around Cambridge Analytica is essentially that they were insufficiently paternalistic in the way that they made it so easy for users to share with other developers. And so I wonder what the kind of both like user experience and human-computer interaction framework is, as well as the legal framework to make that kind of thing possible. Kartik, did you want to? Oh,
yeah,
no,
Kartik, do you please take it?
Okay, yeah, I guess I'll just share a couple quick thoughts on that. I think in giving users a little more control over what they see, there's ample research that it does increase user trust in these systems. However, there is very little research that validates that it actually improves performance, that they know how to move the knobs in the right way, they know how to make the right choices, and are they happier in the long run? It's not clear. In fact, there was I forget which year this was, but Facebook did this. They rolled it out, a system where they gave you these show me more posts from friends, fewer news posts, or show me, whatever. It's a bunch of knobs that people could move. And what they found after they rolled it out to, some treatment group was that treatment group said that they were happier, but then when they looked at, how much of the news, how much of the feed they were engaging in, it was a lot lower. Maybe in the long run, it's better for users to spend less time on social media. So maybe it's good for society. But I think, again, Facebook is a for-profit company and they're looking at what is it doing to the users. People don't know to move these knobs and they make poor choices. And then Facebook decided not to deploy that.
Or often they make choices and those choices were the right choice then, but they become irrelevant over time, right? That people choose who they really want to prioritize in their feed, and then they don't update that 2 years later.
That's
and
right.
Now they're not actually seeing the content that's most important to them. So I think there's a bunch of interesting challenges there. And I think your example also gets at just the question of what are the right metrics here? And that's one point where algorithmic transparency could potentially help, because the metrics we may want to look at as researchers and as a public could be quite different than the ones that these firms are looking at, especially if they're kind of myopic about driving engagement, et cetera. Now, we know in some cases the firms are looking at more complicated metrics. In one of the leaked Facebook studies, Facebook turned off ranking for some users and put it on reverse chronological ranking, and users' time spent went up, advertising revenue went up. A bunch of other things that Facebook considered bad also went up a lot. And so they weren't going to go with that. But I think it highlights that there are these complex trade-offs between metrics being made. Sometimes firms are accounting for some of these broader issues, but maybe insufficiently so. And hopefully algorithmic transparency would be one way to get more scrutiny on some of those other outcomes that we care about as the public.
Yeah, just one more quick note on that is, when we say, hey, giving people control, they feel happy to have the control, but so far the evidence shows that they don't know what to do with it or how best to use that. Similarly, we had a recent study that was looking at all these recent interest in this whole field that's called interpretable machine learning or explainable AI. So when you have an AI system making decisions, let's say in this case, figuring out how to rank the newsfeed, how to rank the posts in the newsfeed. And that field is focused on letting, because a lot of these systems feel like black boxes, how do you get information on which factors were the most important that resulted in a certain choice or a certain prediction, and what drove this? And giving that information, we found in our study, at least, that end users, that information did nothing to do drive trust. But what it all comes down to is we're finding just sharing that information is not driving trust, or giving users control is not driving engagement. But maybe it's a user interface design issue. Maybe it's a human computer interaction issue. And when we talk about algorithms today, we're sometimes talking about two extreme, or not extreme, but two different lenses. One is the engineering computer science lens, with which we look at things like interpretability or transparency or user control. And the other is a very social science perspective of it. And there's a human computer interaction perspective that I think even within algorithms, within algorithmic transparency is super important. And I don't see enough being done there. And that's, I think, where the answers might lie, actually, where we can give users more control and really create greater education, greater self-awareness, better end outcomes for users and the platforms.
Yeah, and I mean, it seems like a great area for a lot of potential innovation, where maybe new entrants could distinguish themselves on that, whether in a kind of middleware model or entirely as new entrants. I think it's interesting, though, that some of the most successful new entrants in social media are kind of not like that at all. In fact, they're sort of more black boxy than anything that came before them, right? If you think of something like opening up TikTok and just you're seeing things for unknown reasons and have very indirect control over that. But I think that's a really interesting area for innovation. So I think we're actually just running out of time. I feel like we could all say a lot more about this. I just want to thank both of the panelists, Kartik and Daphne, for for bringing their expertise to this, I think from two different perspectives that really meshed well here. So thanks for guiding us through this challenging topic of algorithmic transparency. So we're gonna now turn to a break, and things will resume in 30 minutes.